Shalom, this is Dan, and I want to talk with you about our next Torah portion. It's called Ekev, and it means the word because. Now this comes from Deuteronomy 7:12 through 11:25. And this portion is no bigger than any of the other portions that we look at, really. But for me personally, there's quite a few things in here that I find interesting, and I want to share with you. Now, the first thing I want to share with you is the word itself, Ekev. It sounds interesting to start off a Torah portion with the word because. Now, I looked up this word, and it actually translates in some other translations as because or wherefore. When you kind of consider this word still, my first question is, because of what? Or because of who? And so, let's look at the first verse that opens up this portion here. Again, it's from Deuteronomy 7:12. This is the first verse. And it says, because, or wherefore, it shall come to pass, if you pay attention to these laws, and are careful to follow them, then the Lord your God will keep his covenant of love with you, as he swore to your forefathers. So we get this, and wherefore makes, I guess, maybe a little bit more sense than to say because. Because when you think of the word because, you think because of what? Well, wherefore kind of is more of a starting point. From here, or starting here, it shall come to pass. I just want to throw that out there for you. But the fact of what this verse is saying, I'm reminded of sheep. Now, I know it's probably kind of interesting to think about sheep here, but Moses was a shepherd before he got drafted into saving the nation. So let's talk about sheep for a little bit. You see, in my research, I found that sheep are actually kind of not the smartest animal in the world. I don't want to say stupid, because they're really not stupid, but they seem to not always be wise. They kind of follow the pack, and with that, you can find sometimes that the sheep do things that the other sheep are doing. So if one goes one way, they kind of all go the same direction. They need a leader, which is where Jesus comes, and he becomes our leader. But let's talk about, and we see that in John 10:27, where we see that Jesus is saying, my sheep know me, they hear my voice, and they obey. Jesus became the shepherd, and he started giving these sheep direction. But along with that, let's talk about some of the people in the past here. We have Solomon. Now, a command had been given. Obviously, we've read it here in the Torah before. The command was given to not include in your marriage people outside of the Jewish race. And we see that, we had this whole thing with Phineas, and he got mad because the Midianites started creeping in there. But if we consider Solomon, we see that Solomon did the same thing. Solomon began to bring in all these different cultured women, all these different races, and soon he has 300 wives, 700 concubines, and even though he's the smartest man in the world, he still loses some of what God wanted to give him because of his disobedience. If we see here in 1 Kings 3:12, it says here that Solomon was the smartest man to live. But then Solomon's wisdom was a result of God questioning him, which God said, would you like me to wipe out your enemies? Or what would you like me to do? And Solomon said, well, I'd like to be wise. Well, God granted him that, plus gave him the other stuff because he made a sound decision. But in 1 Kings 3:14, God's response was, if you walk in my ways and obey my statutes and commands, as David your father did, I will give you long life. But Solomon didn't obey all God's ways, and so we see that because he made a mistake, not only was his life possibly cut short, but his kingdom was divided. Now, we've talked about Saul before, but let's look at Saul as well. Here we are in 1 Samuel, and now we see that Saul's non-obedience or non-full obedience in what God had told him concerning the Amalekites cost him his kingdom, because we see that Saul was taken from his kingly position. In chapter 15, chapter 16, you read that here we got David being anointed as a new king because God rejected Saul, and then bam, you go over to chapter 17, and you got David facing Goliath, and that's pretty much where he made his stance as a leader for the Israelites. So we see this progression where God says, look, if you do it my way, things will go well. If you choose not to do it my way, I can't promise you I'm going to stand behind you. Go back to the verse here, Deuteronomy 7:12, and it says, if you pay attention to these laws and are careful to follow them, then the Lord your God will keep his covenant of love with you as he swore to his forefathers. And that includes us. If we do as God says, if we pay attention to his laws and are careful to obey them, then the Lord our God will keep his covenant of love with us. Do you feel like God is keeping his love, his covenant of love with you? Maybe you do. And maybe you don't. Maybe you feel a little far away. Well, if so, then can I ask, are you doing this other part? Are you paying attention to the laws and being careful to follow them? God is looking for our obedience. We've talked about that before. And God is not up there saying, you didn't do my law, you're in trouble. God didn't put these laws because he wanted to be an evil taskmaster. He put these laws in place so we would have boundaries and we would know the safe parameters. And this is what I tell other people too. The Torah is not just a bunch of don'ts. It can be read that way, but I look at it as a list of do. If you do what I'm asking you to do, you're going to find freedom. If you don't do what I'm asking you to do, you're going to find hard times. You're going to find punishment. You're going to find things aren't going to go the right way. Do we want to be blessed? Then we got to do what God says. Do we want to be cursed? Well, maybe we're on the right track by not doing what God says. Let's move on a little farther. I want us to look at, I'm just going to read from my notes here for a little bit. I want to jump down to Deuteronomy 8:15 and 16. And the verses we read say this. He led you through the vast and dreadful desert, that thirsty and waterless land, with its venomous snakes and scorpions. He brought you water out of hard rock. He gave you manna to eat in the desert, something your fathers had never known, to humble and test you, so that in the end it might go well with you. Again, that's Deuteronomy 8:15 to 16. I like this part, and I want to really bring it to our attention because it starts out, he led you through. God is saying here, or actually Moses is speaking on behalf of God, and he's saying, look, remember, I want you to remember this. He led you through all these problems. He led you through the snakes and the scorpions. He led you through the times of no food, no water, all these type things. We get stuck, I think, maybe I'm just talking about myself. I know for a fact I get stuck sometimes thinking, God, did you forget about me? I feel like I'm like in the middle of the desert and you're nowhere around. And so, did you forget about me? Well, Psalm 23 has a verse in there. I believe it's verse 4. And it talks about how we go through the valley of the shadow of death. I like this verse, even though it's sometimes for me hard for me to swallow. I like this verse because it gives me hope. God leads us through. It doesn't say that I'm going to leave you in the desert. It doesn't say I'm going to keep you stranded there. It doesn't say I'm going to just ditch you in the desert. It says I will take you through, right? It says the valley of the shadow of death is not a place where we make our permanent residence. It's a place where we just pass through. And we see the same thing. The Israelites didn't just get stuck, even though they were there for 40 years in the desert. It was a time of passing through. I have to battle with myself sometimes to know that even though it feels like I'm stuck in this desert, like right now, I feel like I'm stuck in a desert, I have to remind myself of these verses. I have to remind myself of what Deuteronomy 8:15 and 16 say. I have to remind myself of what Psalm 23:4 says, and they come back down to the same word, through. We're going to go through. We're not going to be left. We're going to go through. Mark Lowry has this funny thing where he talks about this personal time that he was in, and he said that he reads the Bible and his favorite verse is, and it came to pass, knowing that it was just a position he was in and he was going to pass through it. Sometimes I can believe it, and sometimes I honestly, like I said, I fight with knowing that I'm just going through and not being stuck because it feels like I'm stuck. But I want to leave you with the same encouragement that I have to build myself up with. Just like it says in Jude 20, build yourself up in the most holy faith. This is what I got to do. I got to give myself a pep talk sometimes and remind myself, just like I want to remind you right now, we are not stuck. We are not deserted in the desert. We are going through. God is making a way for us, and we can't see the end result yet, but we can have the assurance that we are going through. This is a season. All the seasons change. We don't always have winter. We don't always have summer. We don't always have spring and a fall. We have all four of them, and we go through seasons. And this is the season that we are in, but we're going through. And lastly, I want to bring your attention to, I want to jump down again to Deuteronomy 10:12. Here's what the verse says. So now, Israel, all that Adonai your God asks from you is to fear Adonai your God, follow all his ways, love him, and serve Adonai your God with all your heart and with all your being. Again, that's Deuteronomy 10:12. Now, I looked up some of these words, and I want to share the definitions I have here with you. The word fear is the word yer, Y-A-R-E, and it's defined as revere, stand in awe, honor, respect. The word follow is the word yalak, Y-A-L-A-K, means to go, to walk, to proceed, to live in. The word love is, in this case, ahab, A-H-A-B, act of being a friend, lover, or love for another. And then lastly, I looked up the word serve, the word abad, A-B-A-D, and it means to labor, to work, serve as a subject. I want to read that verse to you again, that Deuteronomy 10:12, but I want to read it with these definitions for you. And I hope that you grasp more so the depth of what this verse is saying. If we, with these words here, it reads as so. So now, Israel, all that Adonai your God asks for you is to stand in reverence and awe of Adonai your God. Live in his ways, be his lover, and labor under him as a servant to Adonai your God with all your heart and with all your being. It changes it up a little bit. We see maybe more of the depth of what this verse is saying, but it also becomes more challenging for us because, as we saw in the beginning part where we read that verse about paying attention to what God is saying and obeying what God is saying, now we have another challenge, and this is where I want to leave you in this Torah portion. Do we find ourselves understanding these words, and do they describe us? Again, let me read it to you. So now Israel, or we can put our name there. So now Dan, all that Adonai your God asks from you is to stand in reverence and awe of Adonai your God. Am I standing in awe and reverence of what God is doing? The next part says, live in his ways. Am I living in his ways? Be his lover. Am I being his lover? And then lastly, and labor under him as a servant to Adonai your God with all your heart and with all your being. Am I considered by him, now maybe by me, but by him, am I considered his servant? Am I doing all that he asks of me with my heart and all my being? I can't answer for you. I can only answer for myself. I hope that I fit those definitions. I honestly don't know if I do fit those definitions according to him. You know, I could consider myself a tall person, but am I tall according to a tall person? God has this measuring stick that he's given us, and he measured us according to his measuring stick. I can't make his measuring stick match my thoughts and plans and my measurements. It has to be measured against his. So, in taking this verse, it becomes a challenge to me, and I hope it becomes a challenge to you as well. The whole portion, the whole Torah itself, like I said before, it's not a list of don'ts. It's a list of do's. Do these things, and you'll find my blessing. Do these things, and you'll find that I'm right there for you. But if we choose not to do them, if we choose not to obey, if we choose not to be his servant, if we choose not to love and revere him, and seek him and know him with all of our heart and with all our being, can we really expect his full blessing? Yes, we have grace and we have mercy. God wants us, though, to be obedient. The question I want to leave with you, through all this that we talked about today, is, are we being obedient to what God says? Are we really doing what God says? I leave that for you to think on. Shalom. I'm Dan.